for example, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey
Oh yeah.
was got
Station.
just a formative cinematic magnum opus for me.
Just the guys hanging out, happen to be friends, happen to be friends. They happen to be dads, and they got some good questions.
Welcome to That's a Good Question. I am the professor. I am joined by Coach.
Greetings.
And I am not joined by just Sean, who would normally be introducing me. But I think we're going to carry on anyway today. Our question this time is, are you a real man? Really, this is actually a question that's, I mean, maybe this is something we've talked about before on the show, but maybe that's because it's something that pops into my head fairly frequently. The question is, maybe this is a little too specific to say, are you a real man? Because more generally, it's like, are you a real fill in the blank? I've been thinking a lot about what some might call gatekeeping. Questioning the validity or the worthiness of somebody to be included in a group, a category, to earn a title. Like, I don't know, maybe just to kind of contextualize things a little bit, I recently had a little, like, I don't know, there was a comment made to me recently. I had sort of said something about myself being a linguist, and then somebody else was like, well, a Spanish linguist. And I was like, yeah, I mean, technically that's true, but what I had said wasn't incorrect either.
Interesting.
And there's a tendency, and maybe, academia is maybe sort of fraught with this kind of thing, to, like, I don't know, kind of have to put people in their place. This is the whole gatekeeping idea, the kind of like take you down a peg a little bit. There's this hierarchical structure where, it's like, well, you're not a professor, you're an associate professor. You're not an associate professor, you're an assistant professor. Until pretty recently, I was a lecturer. I didn't even have the title professor. And then my university sort of restructured how they handle the titles and promotion for non-tenure track faculty. And now I do have the title professor, albeit teaching professor, and not just teaching professor, associate teaching professor. So there's like, you're not quite this yet, you're
right.
Remember your place, I guess. Like, you're not one of us. I mean, that's the idea. And ever since I was a kid, I've always sort of been bothered by that. Like, oh, you can't be in our club kind of thing. So, not just are you a real man, but like, yeah, are you a real anything?
Fill in the blank. Yeah, you're not one of us. You're one of them. I think that's kind of one of the conversations we had previously, right?
Yeah.
If you're not one of us, if you're not blank. Yeah. And what is the point of that?
Yeah.
So what do you think the point is of that? So that, let's say that person who was calling you out for only being a Spanish linguist, right? Yeah. Which the intention behind that is to put you down a peg, right? It wasn't to celebrate the fact that you were in fact a specific type of linguist. It was to cut you down, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose so. Either to cut me down, or maybe to make themselves feel better about
prop himself up,
something, or maybe some of both. I don't know. I mean, I guess it's always like, I suppose there's some truth to that old saying, like, oh, the bullies are just bullies because they're insecure about themselves. which I don't know is maybe also something that you tell bullied kids to make them feel better. But like, but I don't know, maybe there's also some truth to it. Yeah, like why would somebody feel the need to even point that out? I don't know, what's the expression, to sort of like justify their own existence, I suppose, you know, because like, oh, my worth or my title isn't worth as much if we're just letting anybody in, you know. Watering down the quality of our little club.
Right. And it also has me wonder, what was the context of the conversation that you brought it up within?
Like, you know, it wasn't even really relevant, and I wasn't even talking to somebody who was a linguist. I mean, it really didn't even, I don't know, it didn't even matter.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Like, what is the point? For the sake of this conversation, he or she could have let it slide, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it didn't make a difference.
Right. That is, I'd say interesting, but annoying is the word that comes to mind. It's super annoying.
Yeah.
I will say, I do have tendencies in that direction, and that is opting for specificity. At times when it really doesn't matter. Yeah. Admittedly, I do that on occasion. I will correct someone. You know, grammar maybe is an example. I don't know if it's getting outside the bounds of this, but you know, insisting upon something that really doesn't matter in that moment. And maybe that's taken too much of a sidestep from it. So, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I think, well, I mean, that's a conversation that as a linguist, and I'm not going to put any qualifier on that.
That's right.
That fascinates me too, because that brings up, and yeah, maybe that's beyond the scope of this conversation. This maybe for another time, but
right.
You know, the question of like prescriptivism, the idea that like there's a right and wrong way to say something, and yeah, if somebody, you know, somebody uses a subject pronoun instead of an object pronoun, and you say, well, actually, it's whom.
Right.
You know,
right.
Yeah, there's that like sort of, you know, correcting, but I think in a similar, you know, I think it maybe sometimes at least comes from a similar place, because there's this idea that like, I don't know, for whatever reason, some of us feel the need to point out when somebody else has said something that's not totally correct. You know, again, to sort of justify our own position or make ourselves feel better or something, or just, you know, point out that like I knew something that you didn't know or whatever.
Right. What I just written down was the idea of identity and belonging.
Yeah, belonging.
And so maybe by you using, not you of course, but someone using incorrect grammar in an instance, me calling it out is saying, oh, I have this identity of someone who knows what's what, and therefore you do not.
Yeah.
And that type of language does not belong in a conversation with me.
Yeah. I think that also, to sort of bring it back a little bit to the initial question, I think that part of what that brings to mind for me is I suppose you could say a counter argument, which is that like, you know, you this other person, maybe they feel like they're being more precise, but you could always be even more precise than that. So what's the point of you know, even like pointing out my error, because I could point out a further error in what you've said. You know, I remember, gosh, these weird things that sort of stick in my mind. I remember watching a show one time, and somebody on the show had ordered food at a restaurant, and they asked for bruschetta, and somebody else, but well, actually, it's bruschetta. And then I thought to myself, you know, that's not really the Italian pronunciation of that word either, right? This is sort of what I'm saying. Like, I could correct the way that you have pronounced that word. But yeah, it was that kind of like, I just want to show off that I sort of know a thing that it seems that you didn't know.
Well, because it doesn't feel good to be corrected pretty much in any instance, right?
Yeah. No.
And so in this instance of the TV show, you were being defensive on behalf of the other character.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do we do that? Because it doesn't make anybody feel good. At no point does anyone say, you know what? Thank you so much for correcting me, especially in this environment, like right now.
Yeah.
Like why? That's very interesting.
Because again, like I think there's another common thread there where it's like you know what I mean. I mean,
Right.
when the server took the order and they said bruschetta, the server didn't stand there baffled like I have no idea what you're even. That's not on the menu.
Right. That's right.
Or if I tell somebody I'm a linguist, like it doesn't. Again, it's sort of like irrelevant. The correction doesn't.
Right. It doesn't confuse the meaning at all.
Yeah, and I don't go around. See, there's another one that's sort of related to that. Where like I have a PhD, I have a doctorate, and I could
a doctorate or a PhD?
Yeah, well, both. I mean, it is a doctorate, and I could rightfully go around telling people that I am a doctor.
Yeah.
In fact, I am. I mean, and but certainly I wouldn't do that in contexts where, like, if somebody's having a heart attack, and then they're like, well, is there a doctor around? I'm not going to, technically,
you probably weren't asking for a any doctor. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, but that's also the same kind of thing where it's like, oh, not a doctor, like, because certainly when people hear that word, they have physician in mind. They have MD, not PhD.
Well, even an MD, right? You can get even more specific. Well, I'm a podiatrist, so
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, it's just kind of like, oh, you're not like not a real doctor.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we can essentially just sum up: whoever does this is a douche canoe and needs to be taken down a peg, right?
Yeah.
So how do we do that? We just have to get more specific. We have to beat them at their own game.
I guess so. Just
is that the only way to beat them?
Cut them down at the knees.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, but I mean, I guess to me, it's almost like, why does there need to be a conflict in the first place? Like that's the part that irks me. Is it's like who are you to decide who has the right to use a certain word as their title? I guess to some extent, yeah, like there's like a kernel of value there, because we don't want just anybody to just up and say, I'm a doctor. Like, you want there to be like a certain amount of qualification there. But at the same time, I suppose we don't need to go around putting people down. I don't know. I thought of you a little. I thought of you a little bit when I was kind of pondering this topic.
Yeah.
Because your profession uses a term, coach, that has been applied, and similar to the doctor example, coach, not just to anybody who guides or mentors or advises or trains, but specifically to somebody who guides and mentors athletes, right?
Right.
So if you tell somebody you're a coach, they might immediately ask, like, oh, what sport?
Yep.
So
that's absolutely what I was thinking of when you brought this up was the fact that you don't have to be certified to be a coach, right? And the insistence upon, well, I'm a certified coach, or if someone says you're a coach, oh, is it a sports coach? And then people just kind of go on from there and kind of make different assumptions. I found that trying to remove myself from any comment that someone makes on the subject is usually the best, and usually also just as difficult. Because in my instance, and perhaps in yours, it's in some ways this is part of my identity, how I identify. Certainly professionally. And so when someone says something that isn't quite specific or quite specifically accurate, then, there's a part of me that's like, but That's not actually true. Like, you know, and then I try to catch myself because this happens so frequently. I've become a lot more aware of this phenomenon in myself. And so because this happens so frequently, I've tried really hard to catch myself and say, okay, what's the point of this whole conversation? What's the point of them referring to me as a coach? Is it just to move? Is it to identify me in the story so we can move past? Or is that the main point? Is the main point that I am a coach and that I'm a specific type? But I'll tell you, it's not easy to do all the time because I do tie that to my identity. And I wonder if you consider a linguist as being a linguist as part of your identity.
I suppose I do. I mean, I like I said, I think there is a certain amount of value to like saying that these categories have meaning, that we're not just, throwing them around anyway, because if somebody says like this person's a linguist, and sometimes you'll see that in like read an article and they'll interview a person who identifies themselves as a linguist, and every once in a while I'll be reading one of these articles and it becomes clear to me that this person is just kind of like an amateur linguist. This person is just, they're like, they're just like some guy who's interested in language.
They happen to be talking on the subject right now.
Yeah, right. Again, like, well, you're not a real whatever. That certainly, that certainly comes up, and like, so I'm sort of torn sometimes because there's part of me that wants to be able to say, well, you just whatever, like, who cares? Anybody can use any title, but at the same time, certainly when there are occasions, we're imagining like somebody having a heart attack in a restaurant, there are occasions where like a certain type of doctor or whatever, it could literally be a matter of life and death.
Right.
Or, we don't just want anybody sort of using that title. But
Right. So in that way, it is sort of gatekeeping, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
So in that instance, though, there's probably an appropriate social responsibility to maintain that level of gatekeeping, right? You don't want anyone operating, right? You don't want anyone stepping in a life or death situation, possibly.
Yeah.
And being reckless if they're not qualified. So is that an argument for continuing this trend?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I think I like what you were saying a moment ago, where you were pointing out that like, when it's relevant, when it's the point of the conversation, like in that case, if somebody's, if it is a matter of life or death, if somebody's having a medical emergency, then that is the point. That like, when I asked for a doctor, I had a specific type in mind, and one would hope that we could all use a certain amount of, shall we say, common sense to know, that, I mean, like I said, I was, I'm not going to raise my hand and be like, you should be more specific.
So, okay. So that makes me wonder, what can you do then in the instance where you have this non-linguist calling you out for not being a pure linguist? Like, what do you do with that situation moving, like, in the future? You said yourself, the conversation itself had nothing to do with linguistics necessarily.
Yeah.
So because obviously it seems like you had this sense of defensive-ness.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like the way it was thrown at you as an attack, right? As a slight. It's like, well, Spanish linguist, right?
Yeah, I sometimes if I'm feeling particularly prickly,
feeling a little saucy.
I might somewhat passive aggressively kind of slide in there, like, oh, did I say something that was wrong? Or, like, I mean, just to kind of point out, like, was I incorrect to say that? Like, if you're gonna imply that something I said was in fact inaccurate, I don't think it was. All right, let's go there. Like, if that's what you want to do, if you want to, because I mean, that's probably what I would do. Something like that.
Yeah. Throw down the gauntlet.
Oh, sorry. What did I say that was incorrect?
Yeah.
You know?
Perdón. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just retort in Spanish.
Yeah. Yeah. I had actually, this sort of brings up an example, and actually I'm suddenly wishing that Sean were here, because I have an example that involves somebody I know, not Sean,
yeah.
who happens to be an architectural engineer.
Ooh, yeah.
And I remember being sort of a third party in a conversation where this architectural engineer said something about engineering, and the other person in the conversation is also an engineer. And
what kind of circle were you finding yourself in where all these engineers were just...
I don't know. I talked to lots of people.
Yeah. As a linguist.
And this was actually it was like a holiday gathering. But anyway, the other engineer said something like, "Oh, but you're like an architect," or something. I forget how it was worded. But it was very much like, "Oh, you're not like a real engineer." Like it was like,
yeah, the hierarchy.
Yeah. It was just, I just kind of maybe like took a sip of my tea and like, because the other person, actually, the reason I was thinking of is because the architectural engineer was like, "No, I'm an engineer." Like the architectural part, that's an adjective that modifies the noun engineer.
Right.
And ultimately, like, and this kind of, like to sort of bring it back to the beginning a little bit, is like ultimately, like, okay, so somebody who ends up being an architectural engineer, they sort of specialize, but certainly they've taken like courses and they've been trained in general engineering, as have I been trained in general linguistics.
I guess the major question in that instance would be, am I qualified to continue in this conversation or not?
Yeah.
Right. Does making me an architectural engineer make me less qualified to speak?
Yeah.
I mean, in that instance, like, what were you just, a charity case being allowed to witness this conversation? You certainly aren't an engineer.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I can't really remember what the conversation was, but that also reminds me that like, you could always, going back to the like correcting somebody, you could always be more and more correct. That person who pointed out, like, whatever it was they were talking about, okay, sure, like party A may have been somewhat more qualified than party B to speak on it, but there's somebody else out there who's even more qualified than you are.
Yep.
And to act like, okay, you're the authority, just in this conversation, you're the authority. But
yeah, I think those two things there, the context, like, what the hell are we doing here? Like, what's the point of this conversation? What's the context of this conversation? Are we giving a talk? Are we giving a TED talk here? Or are we at a cocktail hour?
Yeah.
What is the point? And I think the level of douchebaggery could always be dialed down in any situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So I guess what's the point of gatekeeping is to what?
Yeah, I think it is probably the kind of thing that started out with good intentions, started out with, like I said, that the goal of making sure that this category doesn't get watered down. That in order to use a title, engineer, for example, that you have to have some qualifications. Started out that way, but
to protect the prestige of it.
Yeah, but because we don't want charlatans walking around and saying, sure, I can inspect this building for you, and you're just some dude, right?
Yeah.
But in probably most of the time that it comes up, like, I think that kind of gatekeeping, the, like, the desire to make sure that people are qualified for something, that probably doesn't come up nearly as often as the conversational kind, which is more likely just people trying to, I don't know, bolster their own self-confidence or something.
And then even in those instances where it's a matter of human safety or even life and death, how important is it that you articulate your credentials at that point, right? That you that you're that insistent upon them being articulated properly and correctly and specifically. Like, I would suggest that it's not. Right?
Yeah.
And maybe not ever important. And the more that someone is insistent upon it, perhaps you have to wonder what's really going on. You know, is there some other deficit being covered up? At least that's where I'm going. That's where my mind goes with that.
Yeah, I think intuitively I agree. That makes a lot of sense to me, because most of the time people who are qualified and who are really good at what they do, people who are experts, tend to have a certain level of like comfort, and maybe don't feel the need so much to like, you know, go around showing it off. I mean, like I mentioned academia as being this place that sort of like institutionalizes gatekeeping. But at the same time, I mean, my colleagues, I work with lots and lots of people who have PhDs, some of whom have more than one PhD. And so for somebody in that kind of a context, like if I'm at a meeting surrounded by all of these people who have advanced degrees, to point out like, hey, I have a PhD, that would just be ridiculous, because everybody does. No one cares. We all have one. Like you're not proving anything.
Right.
I don't know. So maybe it's also sort of
but that wouldn't that be kind of refreshing for someone? You've all grown so complacent. I've got a PhD.
Yeah, maybe just to like, let's remind everybody here.
Yeah.
Like, you know, let's feel good about ourselves for a moment.
Yeah. Hip hip hooray.
Yeah. But yeah, again, contextually, right? You know, maybe it is those contexts, those situations where it's like, I have an opportunity to point out that I've, you know, the feather in my cap that these other people don't have.
Yeah. That whole idea of ego. You know, I find that when I catch myself wanting to say something like that I'm a credentialed coach, you know, then that causes me to pause now and be like, why is this important right now? Am I trying to put someone else down? You know, am I just trying to raise myself up? And what is the point of doing that? Just to make myself feel better? In the context of this conversation, does it even matter? Am I trying to am I competing with this one other non-credentialed coach for a client? And is this how I want to do it? It's like, no, probably not. Like there's no real good that will come out of this situation. It's just my ego being slightly threatened. And maybe that fear in the back of my mind that, like, does my credential not mean something?
Yeah.
Maybe. But I'll tell you, instinctively, my ego is just like ready to go to battle to defend my honor. Yeah. That, by the way, isn't probably even being called into question, right? But it's this trigger. And maybe this person who called you a Spanish linguist wasn't trying to kick you in the nuts. Maybe they were, I don't know. But it certainly felt like they were kicking around that area. They grazed them a bit.
Right. Yeah. Because, you know, again, like you wouldn't have said it at all if you weren't trying to do that.
Probably, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it may have been intended as a sarcastic joke, and I just didn't get the joke, or you know,
right? Or some people say jokes that aren't funny too. There's that possibility.
That's true. Maybe I got the joke. I understood the joke.
It's like you're really it's not funny. It didn't land.
Yeah. I'm suddenly, you know, reminded of another example because, you know, my wife Jamie has a BFA, a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. And artist is very much a title that people will use, you know, that you know, in the like Etsy, Instagram kind of world, one can call oneself an artist.
I called my 9-year-old an artist.
Yeah, and like practically speaking, most of the time, sure, whatever, that's fine. But there are definitely occasions where you know, Jamie will get like irritated, you know, that somebody or let's say there's some kind of a project that she's working on with a committee or a, you know, school group or something, and they kind of like are throwing around ideas, and you know, there's like somebody else who kind of steps up and says, oh, I can do that, you know, I don't know, like I can paint or whatever. And Jamie's like, yeah, well, kind of claiming to be an artist, but you're, whatever. Like,
yeah, that's interesting. It maybe in a way feels like it cheapens the accomplishment.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's always a little bit of that, that it's like, at least in her case, and I mean, in my case too, it's like, yeah, I mean, I worked hard for this thing and it is legitimate. And most of the time I don't feel like I need anybody else to confirm that for me. But I, there are occasions where it's like, I feel like I have to, hey,
Yeah.
like defend this thing. Kinda.
Yeah, exactly. Wear a stethoscope around your neck just in case,
Yeah.
so people know. Yeah. So, but it's one thing to not necessarily have to feel like you have to affirm it all the time, right? But it's another to feel like someone's kind of taking a shot, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like when that kind of gets threatened a little bit, right? Like it's like whoa. It's like I'm not going around saying I'm the bee's knees here, but I ain't a bag of dicks either. I think that was Dr. Seuss that came up with that one. So I'm interested in bringing this back to the original question, which was framed in the form of, are you a real man? So what thoughts do you have around that? What ideas are kind of connected around that?
Yeah, I think that was like the first one that came to mind, because I think that's I don't know, just in terms of like frequency, that's maybe the noun that follows real in that expression most often. If you were a real man, you'd whatever, like, you're not a real man.
Well, it affects the largest, population that we've talked about so far, right?
It's a pretty large category.
Yeah. Potentially. Yeah.
Between 3 and 4 billion people who
identify
who may lay claim to that title. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what makes a real man?
Yeah. Well, I think that's why I thought it was such a good example of the phenomenon, because I think we have this kind of like received wisdom, and like depending on the culture that you've been raised in, there are some assumptions about what constitutes a man, how a man should behave, how a man should look and think, and and I think we live in a time where perhaps more so now than ever before, that category now includes people who have such widely varying ideas about what it means. And I, as I so often love to do, to take myself as an example, I grew up doing the kind of like traditional stereotypical kind of man that is like masculine sorts of things, like, I don't know, playing baseball and woodworking with my dad and stuff like that. But I also, like I enjoy cooking, and my mom taught me to sew, and I do lots of things that are also considered sort of like, at least in the 80s and 90s growing up, very kind of like geeky and nerdy, which is also not very masculine, or at least at the time was especially not.
For sure. The gender roles were a lot more clearly defined and insisted upon. Yeah.
And so, maybe it's partly an acknowledgement on my part that this idea of a real man is changing, and it's becoming less and less worthwhile to even try to argue that there's like a specific checklist for what constitutes a real man,
right? Or there's a challenging of the value of that checklist too, right? That being considered the authority, that checklist is no longer the the measuring stick for so many people. It doesn't hold water so much for. However, at the same time, you still have a population of folks that will defend that checklist to the hilt or whatever. So that's becoming interesting as well. And I think the use of phrases like "man up" and "be a real man" and things like that, I think those are and those are now triggers, right? And maybe they always were, right?
Yeah.
But I think more and more, at least in the social discussion, I think they're a lot more. What am I trying to say? They're up for interpretation, and I think they're not even really they're not even they don't have as much weight behind it anymore. You know, there was almost like a threat, like knocking you down a peg or two, and now it's like, okay, I know your perspective, and I choose whether or not to accept that or not.
Yeah,
it's very interesting. We watched the Sandlot last evening, and one of the barbs being tossed back and forth was the final one was, "You play ball like a girl." And that was kind of a drop the mic moment that everyone decided universally that was the worst thing ever, right? To play ball like a girl.
Yeah.
And there were a few instances throughout that movie that, of course, came out in the early to mid 90s, and that were very, very gender specific, right? That were very much, outdated at this point, frankly. Yeah. And so I think having this discussion now would be very different than having this discussion, 20 years ago, for example. I have a feeling that people may have had it, but it probably had a very different context to the conversation. Like, what the hell's wrong with these guys? Right. Compared to,
yeah. And I mean, some of it is like, since you're mentioning movies, I mean, there are several of those, I've got some movies that, man, I just loved as an adolescent. I still love, and I'll rewatch, for example, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey.
Oh yeah.
Was just a formative, cinematic magnum opus for me. But there's a part in that where they, I can't remember exactly what's happening. I'll have to rewatch it. But they, Bill and Ted, hug, I think, their evil doppelgangers. They hug, and then they, like, the bad guy, the evil guys, like, sort of push them away, and they're like, "Fag," where it's like, man, two guys hugging each other.
That's right. Themselves.
Themselves. Which is like, I mean, there's an extra layer there of the, like, homophobia, but also that it's like, it's just generally inappropriate for two males to hug each other, and that was what was that, 1991. But I mean, certainly people were having the conversation, like you said, and I remember even when I was younger than that, the mother of one of my friends saying something like, "It's okay for you guys to, like, hug each other," like, that like, it was sort of like, being discussed, but definitely not acceptable. Like,
not acceptable. Yeah. And it was someone's mom, a woman, saying this.
Right.
So
yeah. Like,
it's like, okay, that's such a female thing to say.
Yeah. Right. Like, oh, you're just trying to force it now. Like,
right.
We're not gonna hug. Okay.
That's right. No one's dad told you that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like, now that's like, I mean, I wouldn't even think of that as even being, like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, surely there are people around who would look at that and be like, gross.
Sure.
But I mean, I hug everybody. Like, it's, like, it's not even a thing anymore.
Not even a thing. You don't feel like your masculinity is threatened. No. Probably doesn't even enter your mind when you give hugs.
Yeah. And some of that, again, to go back to this idea of, like, I mean, we talked about traditions before too. And I think a lot of them are silly because of the arbitrariness of all of it. That, like somehow putting your arms around somebody, like, makes you feminine. What like,
yeah,
and that has changed too. Like, ideas about what's appropriate behavior for like two male friends to engage in. I was just listening to something not long ago about like sort of like medieval and Renaissance Europe, when it was not uncommon for men to like, if you had like a male house guest, it was just like share the same bed to sleep.
Right.
Like, that's not weird at all.
Yeah.
When today, even today, where it's okay for two men to hug each other, but like sleeping in the same bed, I mean, like that would still be a little bit weird.
Right. That it'd take a moment of pause. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So what is a real man these days? Like the whole definition of that is changing, right?
Yeah, because actually the funny thing is, and maybe this is kind of a great example, the topic was actually that Richard the Lionheart, king of, I guess technically king of England, but maybe more French than English, who's like, I mean, gosh, the guy's nickname was Lionheart. I mean, he was a king. Like, I mean, does it get any more like masculine? It's sort of like, right. The male sort of archetype, the king. This is the guy who was played by Sean Connery in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. So, but they were talking about how, this wasn't uncommon for him to do that sort of thing, the sort of courtly life in like medieval Europe.
Right.
Yeah. So again, it's kind of like, well, we have these traditions, we have these ideas, but so many of them are just kind of like, you just made this up. Like,
right? Isn't it all just a social construct?
Yeah.
Yeah. What part of it is real?
Yeah. That, I mean, it was just kind of like, yeah, like I said, for whatever reason, it was really sort of like bouncing around in my head a lot lately. And I had that sort of relatively, that recent example that kind of brought it to mind. But yeah, I mean, it's something that kind of always kind of simmers under the surface for me. I'm always kind of like a little bit aware of this gatekeeping or category preservation, the kind of desire to like, we gotta fortify our boundaries here.
Yeah.
Let's not let the riffraff in.
So if let's think of an instance when you were introduced to somebody else, you were being introduced by somebody else, and they maybe incorrectly identified your profession. At what point would you insist upon correcting them?
I don't know. Man, that's, well, as we've said, it's very, very dependent on like the specific context, but there have been occasions where somebody would say something like, oh, Joe teaches Spanish or something like that, where I might kind of, to the extent that it's actually relevant, or if somebody asks me, what do you teach or something? Well, I teach like a lot of things, I might sort of clarify, kind of point out, like, oh yes, I mean, I certainly do teach Spanish, but that's not the only thing I teach. Or if somebody said, because actually the problem is that if I'm introduced as a Spanish professor or if I'm introduced as a linguist, somebody's going to get the wrong idea either way, because who knows what a linguist is.
Right.
Because usually if somebody finds out that I'm a linguist, they'll be like, oh, how many languages do you speak? Because surely that's what a linguist does. A linguist goes around just collecting languages to speak.
Right. Yeah.
So there's, somebody's going to get the wrong idea either way.
Yeah. I guess that's true. Yeah.
I do both. I mean, I'm a Spanish professor, but I'm also, I teach linguistics and Spanish.
Right.
And,
But again, if you're being invited into a pickup basketball game, for example, you might just let that one slide. Like, yep, I teach Spanish.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't even, I don't know. Like they could introduce me as an accountant, and I'd be like, yeah, whatever, close enough.
I was going to say, yeah, you might not even get that much of that level of specificity. Like, hey, this is Joe. Yeah, that might be it.
Right.
It's like, actually, it's Joseph. I go by Joe sometimes. But,
Dr. Joe, actually,
Right.
if you don't
That's
mind.
right. Yeah, that's right. Insist upon that. Oh goodness. Yeah. So I guess there's two angles to this, right? When we notice it happening, either we're the ones insisting upon the gatekeeping, or we're approaching the gate and being assessed,
Yeah.
being judged whether or not we go in. And then so I guess, what do we do in that situation? What do we insist upon? Is it worth going through that gate, or acknowledging this gate that someone else is putting up for us? And conversely, do we notice when we're doing it? And what's the point of us doing it? Is it a matter of life and death? In our circles, probably not really, ever. So why do it?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I think again, there's a part of me that sort of wishes like that why do we need a gate at all?
Right.
Just whatever. I mean, because realistically, no two doctors or linguists or lawyers or coaches are going to be exactly the same anyway. When do you ever encounter two examples of one category that are exactly alike in every single characteristic or every single qualification or experience? And even if you do, that doesn't mean that they're going to behave the same way or be as good at their job as the other.
But isn't that actually the point of being insistent upon the specificity? Because no two are exactly the same. Don't you want to qualify it?
Well, I suppose, but then the problem is that goes back to the idea that you can always be more specific. Because if you're pointing it out to say, I just want to remind everybody that I have a little extra qualification that this other person who claims to have the same title that I do had,
right.
Well then, yeah, I mean, you could always get even more minute with your, more fine grained with your qualification. But yeah, I mean, because that's the thing. I guess what I'm trying to say is that ultimately, the only perfectly specific category is going to be so specific that it includes you and only you. Which maybe is kind of, for some people, maybe that's, oh, great.
Right.
That's what I want. I want it to be only me. But then I think to me, the problem is, well, if you're the only one in the category, then what value does that category even have anyway? Like, congratulations, you're by yourself and nobody cares.
Right. You don't belong to any group.
Yeah. Right. You've been so selective that you've selected yourself right out of the thing that you were clinging to, or.
Right. Yeah.
That's like I mean, again, maybe this is like for another conversation, but like, that's the problem that I have with ideas about like purity and homogeneity. Because if you start sort of snipping away the little bits that aren't perfect, or kind of distancing yourself from any of those people that you think don't quite belong with you and your group, well, the more you snip away, eventually you're just left by yourself. Like, you have to make concessions,
Right. Yeah, this is good. I am thinking about the the angles that we might have missed out on not having Sean here. So I'd be curious to get his take on these things.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was sort of wondering about his thoughts on the engineer thing. I mean, and there's always there's also the the question of like, yeah, I suppose it would come up with engineers as it does with somebody in my field, where it's kind of like, all right, you've got this title, but are you actually like a practicing engineer, or, like, because there are engineers who like work on job sites and are like designing and helping to like guide massive suspension bridges, and then there are engineers who maybe like spend most of their day kind of sitting behind a desk, working on a computer, and it's like, again, it's like, well, are you like really like, that's what I was sort of wondering about.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that just opened up a couple more things for me. We'll have to figure out another time to bring this up, because it made me think of religion, right?
Yeah.
It's like, are you a real Christian?
Yeah.
Right. It made me, I was watching one of these YouTube videos, and it had some choral group in the armed services, right? And so they specifically sing as their quote unquote job in the military, right? And so are they a real airman? Are they a real soldier, right?
Yeah.
So within this scale, you have the title, but maybe you don't do of the things that we consider that a real fill in the blank would do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like, I tend to look at that kind of a situation. I think that's a great example. And because I am very inclined to say, well, I mean, there's more than one kind of real soldier. Religion is another great example where you see, people will make claims about that, or question, are you a real, Christian or whatever. But that's also a wonderful example of a situation where you that means different things to different people. Like one person's idea of a real Christian, real whatever, could be very different from someone else's, idea of what that means. So to say you're not a real whatever is assuming that we all agree on what that means, which
right.
We don't.
Is there a universal definition? What's the authority on deciding?
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, I appreciate you bringing up this topic. I think, like we said, we could probably take some other angles on it moving forward. It also made me think, is this even a real podcast?
Probably for some it's not. Probably for some of the people in this podcast.
That's right. It comes and goes. In waves. Yeah. Sometimes it feels more real than others.
Yeah. But that's another example, to go back to like the artist thing that I was mentioning earlier. That's another example where it's like, do you need any kind of credentials or qualifications to host up and produce a podcast? I mean,
right.
I don't think so. Like if I just create some content, and this is where, again, social media and, YouTube and Instagram are wonderful examples, because I mean, I can just create a thing and put it out there. And if a bunch of people look at it, that qualifies me just as much as anybody else. Are you a real, I don't know, a musician? Musician might be another good example. Like you can, I mean, I can go bang on some pots with wooden spoons in my kitchen, and if somebody wants to like download that and pay me for it, that sort of makes me a musician, right? Or does it? I don't know.
And can you age out of that? Like at a certain point, if you don't make money at it, are you allowed to call yourself a musician?
Yeah, right. Or like, when was the last time you actually put a record out? Or,
Right.
Yeah, are you still a musician? Or, now you seem to be focusing much more on your fashion line these days.
Right.
A real musician.
Well, I think at this point in the conversation, I'm not sure what I am at all.
Yeah.
Other than myself.
Yeah, which was kind of my point, right?
Right.
Is that like, the only category that you really are an authority on is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But even that is many times it's fluid, it's in flux. And
Mm-hmm.
what is it to be oneself? Well, that changes depending on, what time of day it is.
Yeah, precisely. It's situational.
Yeah. 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 I also, just maybe this is like a good sort of closing thought. I feel like I should bring it back to The Simpsons, because one of my all-time favorite moments in that show was an episode where Homer decides he wants to be an inventor. So he goes to the Thomas Edison Museum. He sees all these wonderful inventions, right? And he's like, I'm gonna be an inventor. And what he does is he creates this little like invention tally kind of chart thing, and he's got himself at one end with 0 inventions, and then he's got Thomas Edison at the other end with however many, and he kind of puts it up on the wall like, I need to get myself up there, I need to fill this up with I'm comparing myself to that standard to become a real inventor or whatever. Reach some kind of criterion, right? That's the idea, like meeting criterion.
Right.
And he gets really frustrated, tries to invent all these things, and it isn't really working out. And then I think they like revisit the museum later, or something happens where he discovers that Thomas Edison had a chart just like that, where he compared himself to Leonardo da Vinci, a real inventor, right? And so again, like you can always take it a step further, or you can always like move the goalposts.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a slippery slope. So as the potential gatekeeper, keep that in mind when you find yourself wanting to insist upon something.
Yeah.
Is there really a point to this? Yeah. Can I get caught in insisting upon this? Can I get, can I be called out, or can it be more specific?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sir, I think that was a successful run at that question.
Yeah. Well, we'll do, I don't know, if we can always do like a sort of a part 2, or like a revisit, or back by popular demand.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you still a real man?
We might want to get some input from.
Oh, I would say we definitely do. I'd say we definitely do. Yeah. Our third leg of the stool here.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. A stool stands up a whole lot better if it's got at least 3 legs.
That's right. That's what I heard. To be a real stool.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a category right there. That like, if you're a piece of furniture with only 2 legs.
Are you real furniture?
Can you call yourself a stool? Is there a? I don't know.
Oh, that's good. All right, sir. I'm going to call it. Appreciate the time, the insights.
Likewise.
And let's do this again soon.
Okay. Yeah. Let's do it again soon, and let's make sure that Sean knows when that is.
Yeah. We might insist upon that. We'll give him a real notification next time.
Yeah.
Just guys hanging out, laughing to be friends.